welcome to another adventure in Australian literature. And this week we are talking about Richard Flanagan's novel, Wanting. Now, before we get started with that, please remember there is our shop, our Redbubble shop, books, writing services, pretty things if you want to support us. Also, please like and subscribe and share the video if you want to support us. Really does help. So there you go. So this week we're looking at Wanting. We're following up from the last video that we did on Riders in the Chariot, and this is nothing like Patrick White, okay? I'm going to talk, but I want to talk about the way in which Richard Flanagan, in contrast to the way Patrick White takes an Indigenous person as a subject of his novel, and how he writes her, Mithana, who is a little girl who is taken in the 1830s by the then governor of Van Diemen's Land, John Franklin and Lady Franklin. John Franklin would later go on to become famously lost in the Arctic, looking for the fabled Northwest Passage. To be honest, as an Australian, no idea. One of the many colonial governors that... There are only 3 colonial governors. I'm from New South Wales, so there are only 3 colonial governors that anybody cares about. Arthur Phillip, because he's the first. Bligh, because he was mutinied against. And Macquarie, because he built stuff. And that's it. The rest of them, who cares? No, the 30s, they went on a big, statue building mania. And so all around Sydney, there are all these people who nobody's ever heard of. Oh, the first this, or the first that, or the first... They're really just these daggy kitsch statues. Nobody cares about them. So he's one of those unknown governors. But this book has its origins in a painting in a museum in Hobart of the little Aboriginal girl in a red dress, Mithana. And Mithana was taken as a small child by the governor and his wife to basically bring up in a to civilize, sort of a 19th century experiment, which, given the nature of these sorts of 19th century experiments on Indigenous people the world over, when he was recalled to England, Mithana was deposited into an orphanage, and any knowledge of her has pretty much disappeared. We do not know what happened to her. She was picked up, dispossessed, treated as a pet, and then abandoned, as though she were a wallaby that couldn't be taken on the trip back to England. So that's something that this book is examining. Now, Richard Flanagan is the first Tasmanian writer that we are having a look at. I'm not the biggest Richard Flanagan fan. I've read a few and I'll bring those, but he's not a writer who I am particularly interested in reading everything that he wrote or he writes. He's not one of those writers for me. I find his books they're very taxing books to read. They're very challenging. I read this years ago, and I reread this for this, and I remembered why I don't read Richard Flanagan books very frequently. He is a very unflinching writer, which when you're dealing with early colonial subject matter means that he's going to look straight in the face of some very, very nasty horrors, especially as this is Tasmania. Tasmanian colonial history is pretty awful. Really awful. This is a world of the settler Indigenous wars, the Black Wars, as Indigenous people attempted to resist the incursion of settlers into their lands. Although this happened all over the country, the fighting in Tasmania was particularly intense and resulted in a particularly brutal retaliation, which eventually resulted in the collecting of Indigenous people together on an island to die out. Literally, they saw that the colonial authorities oversaw deliberate attempts at genocide of the Indigenous people of Tasmania. So this doesn't shy away from that. It also doesn't shy away from the fact that Indigenous people were murdered and their bodies desecrated to provide skulls for the utterly preposterous, debunked pseudoscience of phrenology. There is a reason why Indigenous people in this country are having to fight international institutions to retrieve the body parts of their ancestors. People were murdered, their bodies stripped down, and their skeletons were sent to museums. A lot of this happened in Tasmania, particularly. Graves were robbed to obtain skulls for phrenologists. The dehumanising of the Indigenous people in colonial Australia is staggering, and it means that a book like this that doesn't veer away from that, it doesn't sugarcoat that, is a tough read. But a tough read doesn't necessarily mean you don't read. So that is something I would say when looking at this book. It does not flinch from these things, nor does it flinch from the sexualisation of Indigenous girls, the fact that they're Indigenous, non-white, even to this day, girls are treated as sexual objects much younger than white girls are. So this doesn't shy away from, although fortunately there is no description of, he leaves us in no doubt that this young girl at 10, 11 is sexualized and assaulted by the people for whose care she is in a way that is deemed, oh, but these people, these savages, grow up quicker. This is the same thing that Gauguin said about the women or the girls of Tahiti. this has been an ongoing issue, and these are things that are in this book that are very confronting, and it's part of the reason why, as much as I admire Richard Flanagan for going into these places, I do also find his books are tough going. They are very tough going. So, this book is divided into two narratives. And the two narratives, rereading it, I found that I sort of started skipping one of the narratives entirely. So, John Franklin disappeared in the Arctic Circle in, the 1840s, 1841. John Franklin disappeared in the Arctic Circle. And Lady Franklin, horrified by reports from a writer or reports that said that essentially they think that they had found them, and that, reports came back that not only had they died, but they may have resorted to cannibalism in the depths of slowly freezing to death in the Arctic Circle. She enlists Charles Dickens to write a defence of her husband, and that this couldn't possibly have happened. Even if he died, no way would he descend to savagery. This is something Dickens wrote. You can find it online. It's defence of this Arctic explorer, and his putting on a play. This becoming a play wherein he met the young woman Ellen Tiernan, I think. I didn't reread that bit very particularly, who did become his mistress in the latter part of his life. So that part of the story is, so you've wrote Dickens into this, and Dickens's unhappy marriage and his beginning of an affair. I found that a lot less interesting than the Tasmanian stuff. Richard Flanagan said this is a book about desire, which is why it's called Wanting. It's about the desires of Lady Jane for her husband to be a hero, of Lady Jane for a child, of the colonial, the English wanting this more sensual life that the Indigenous Australians represent to them. It doesn't put wanting onto the Indigenous people, though. One thing Flanagan doesn't do is, because he is dealing with real people, and he feels quite comfortable in fictionalizing the European people, the Indigenous people he is much, much more reticent about overlaying desires on top of them. The Indigenous characters are seen more externally, sort of the result of what their existence speaks to the people who see them, what narratives they put on top of them. So Mathina is not, she's stuck, he has attempted not to fictionalize her. He has, although put himself in the place of a child whose world has been completely dislocated, a world in which she has lost her parents, a world in which she is forced into connection with white people and loses her connection with her own people. He doesn't seem to want to, which is a good thing, want to project too much on top of her. She is already overly projected upon by the white people in the book. And clearly Flanagan doesn't want to be yet another white voice overlaying this girl's life. But what it does is, this is not a big book. This is a tiny little book in it of itself. And the way that he has written this does mean that the Dickens stuff feels a bit like padding. I'm going to say the Dickens stuff does feel a bit like padding, but it does provide a certain relief from some of the horrific aspects of the colonial Tasmanian setting. It is an interesting book. I did once see Richard Flanagan speaking at the Sydney Writers' Festival. I think that was in 2014. It was after he'd written another one of his novels, the one about the prisoners of war in the Second World War. And I already knew him as a writer of incredibly intense and difficult work. And at the time I wanted to ask, how do you protect yourself from such materials? What is your form of self-care as a writer? Which is something that's actually very important to have, is self-care as a writer, so that you're not overwhelmed by this. And Richard Flanagan, I didn't actually end up needing to ask this question, because he answered it himself in his talk. Richard Flanagan doesn't. And I think the way that he spoke about the fact that he is deeply affected by the things that he writes seemed a little bit macho, a little bit a little bit macho. And I thought that's interesting, because the other thing that I would say about Richard Flanagan is I don't like his women. I don't like his women hugely. I think that he has a little bit of a gap in terms of that. Tim Winton is another writer who I don't like their women particularly much. And they were two writers that I read a long time ago and found them kind of like, is this all we get? Is this all we get from Australian writing? I don't like this. So I definitely find that about him. But I did find the fact that he approaches this incredibly dark material. He approaches it unflinchingly, but at the same time, as I had suspected in some ways, he doesn't. I wouldn't even say spare himself. He doesn't take care to protect himself, and I think that has. It's certainly. He's certainly a very a writer on the edge, I would say. I would certainly be concerned about he's a writer on the edge. He's a writer who has recently written a lot less. He was writing a lot, very prolifically, from about the 90s. In the 90s and into the 2000s, he was writing quite prolifically, and now he seems to have petered off somewhat. And I would say that there is an element of his unflinchingness and his gravitation towards very dark material that has impacted this. I also say, as I say, I'm not picking up new Richard Flanagan's, because he does write very dark, increasingly dark. It is not that these stories shouldn't be told, but that they do come with a serious warning. This is not sugar-coated. Tasmanian writers do not sugarcoat. Richard Flanagan does not sugarcoat. It is unflinching, it is unsettling, it is moving. I would say half the story doesn't need to be there. I don't really care about the nothing governor and getting lost in the Arctic. Couldn't care less. Really didn't connect with the Dickens stuff. What I liked and what I was interested in was Mathina's story, which was difficult to write, simply because attempting to write her without overriding her, without making her into something else, was an enormous challenge. And I think Flanagan did manage to do that. But at the same time, the paucity of documents around her meant that it's there. While what is known is very sparse, and then what is not known has to be speculated. And sadly, the speculation is probably where you go, where her life went. Simply because, unfortunately, that is where the lives of a great many Indigenous people went in this time. So if you are interested, wanting, I'd say it's a book that half works, but it's also interesting in terms of looking at how you can write a character who is not your own ethnicity, how you can write without it being a cultural appropriation. But next time, continuing on looking at stories with Indigenous characters, we're going to have a look at an Indigenous writer, Alexis Wright, and her Miles Franklin award-winning novel, Carpentaria. So join us next time for Alexis Wright and Carpentaria. In the meantime, bye. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.